Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. We're really excited to host this synthesis workshop. Whether you came from the User Research Collective or if you've been following along with us, we're really excited to connect with you all this Friday afternoon and excited for the agenda that we have in store. So yeah, we'll talk about where we're going today. So we'll spend a few minutes on an introduction, helping you to kind of learn who Allison and I are, a little bit about sort of what we do, and notably, and then we'll be spending the rest of the call talking about synthesis. So what does it mean? Why does it matter? We'll be taking a look at a specific type of synthesis methodology called Affinity Mapping. We'll also be talking about tagging qualitative data, some tips around writing insights, and then we're hoping to spend the last few minutes to have an open discussion with some of you who are on the call. So that's where we're going. This is our second research synthesis workshop that we've hosted. The other one seemed to be enjoyable. It seemed to be helpful. So we're really excited to be doing this again. It's something that we definitely have plans to do in the future as well. So looking forward to talking with you all at the end of this around what is helpful and what are some of the other topics that you might like to see or discussions that you might like to be a part of in the future. So first of all, nice to meet you all. My name is Brittany Fuller. I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Notably, with about a decade of experience in product management and research. So I've worked with both kind of B2B and B2C product teams, really passionate about understanding customer behavior, human behavior, and how to really get a grasp on that data to understand not just our customers deeper, but also understand, how to use those insights about customers to make better decisions with my team. So, Allison, do you want to give your quick intro as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison. I am co-founder and CXO of Notably. My background is in design. So initially, kind of after art school, worked as a visual designer, interactive designer at an advertising agency. So about 10 years ago, I made the move to technology to become a product designer. And over the years, I've gained experience working at various stage startups, including our own, and in-house at Starbucks as a senior UX designer, and then consulting for some various enterprise companies and innovation teams. So kind of run the gamut as far as like where I've worked in research roles and what size organizations. Yep. So research, like I said, research has always been kind of a part of my design career in some way, but consulting is really where I fell in love with it. I had the privilege of working on research and design projects for clients like Amazon, Starbucks, again, as a consultant, which was kind of fun seeing the other side of it. I've worked for Boeing, Logitech, GE, Chicago Museum of Science and Technology, and Rockwell Collins. My favorite research project to date was for Vancouver International Airport. And here I was able to interview passengers kind of at the airport, and we created personas and a knowledge base for their innovation team. And that experience of really getting sort of immersed into the data, it was a 13-week program, and coming out of the other end, really feeling like we've created just so much clarity and new understanding for everyone, all the way up to the CEO, just like seeing so many ideas for innovation come directly from the research that we did. It was a pretty profound sort of experience that really unlocked something inside of me for research and set me on this path we're on today. So the path that I'm talking about, we created a company called Notably, and that helps people doing qualitative research collect, analyze, and share customer insights. So we combine sort of the researcher's favorite tools, that spreadsheet and the sticky note, to analyze data, and we use AI to do some really dynamic and new interesting things with that data to get to insights faster. For anyone who has done research synthesis before, you can know that it can be incredibly tedious and manual. And we're doing a lot to speed up that sort of boring, tedious data entry part of research so that you can really slow down and think deeper and more creatively and give it the time and energy that it really deserves. We will be using Notably for part of this workshop, but that's not what this is about. But you will get to ask some questions and see the tool. But we're here to talk about synthesis. So the different methods and approaches that you can use, kind of agnostic of whatever your favorite research tool is that you use to get the job done.
Yeah, and just a quick note to add, we're researchers too. The concepts that we're talking about today not only represent our own, or they don't just represent our own experiences as researchers, but hundreds of researchers that we've learned from. We'll be leaning on our own experiences and perspectives, both as a product manager and as a designer with Allison, but we've also had hundreds of these conversations with researchers over the past year. So we're not sharing this out of a vacuum or a bubble. And just another note, the topics and concepts that we're talking about today, they should be applicable and relevant to researchers of all experience levels.
All right, let me unmute there. So at the highest level, assuming people don't know what synthesis is at all, or if you do, kind of a refresher, synthesis is really the process of discerning meaning and making meaning out of data to turn information into knowledge and to really make sense of that mess. Synthesis is like that sense making that happens between design phases. And I like to think of it as like the spark that happens from marinating in the research data. And it's full of just opportunity and excitement for the future. So potential opportunities to solve for. And the thing about synthesis is that it's very elusive and it's very nuanced, and many designers and researchers kind of have their own special sauce to this process. And I didn't actually learn this from school or a book, but by standing side by side with researchers, designers, much more talented and smarter than I am, helping to kind of like open my eyes to different processes and different approaches for doing synthesis. So we're lifting that veil and sharing our process with you. So when we look at where the sense making happens kind of in the process, again, synthesis is like just a fancy word for sense making, right? It's the researcher's attempt to make sense of the data. And this process for some might take hours, or it might take days in my experience, but the work here is fundamentally important. And it's arguably the most critical step in the design process, but yet again, the most elusive and less talked about step.
Yeah, and so there are lots of different methods and activities for synthesizing data, and together these become your toolkit as a researcher to choose from. So when you're sort of swimming in a sea of data and you can't see the forest through the trees, these methods and frameworks, you can call upon them to create a trusted system of rigor and structure around what would otherwise be sort of a subjective and chaotic process. I end up deploying kind of whatever framework feels right for the data in front of me or the challenge in front of me. And the process might change slightly each time. Sometimes we might know going in, we're definitely going to need an empathy map for this because we're working on personas, or journey map seems really important. But sometimes, you may be halfway through the research process and realize that another framework or another toolkit might be helpful. So sometimes you know which tool you may be using going in. Sometimes that is something that you learn or emerges as you're partway through. The important thing to remember here is that these are human techniques and approaches to make meaning out of data. They're not always logical techniques. The goal is to create repeatable processes so that you can quickly process this data, find meaning, and you want to save time here really so that you can get to the point where you're spending more time kind of during the last phase of research, so during ideation and during the time when you're coming up with solutions.
Yep. So one of the methods we're going to be talking about today is affinity mapping. And affinity mapping is it's one of the simplest and effective activities that you can do for synthesis. And it's a really great collaborative experience as well. So it's very effective with 1 to 2 other designers or researchers who have preferably been involved in the study. It's less about finding those perfect relationships and more about finding good relationships. So when you think about doing an affinity map from a study, all of the content is going to be related in some way, right? Like it was likely conducted under under similar circumstances, or maybe even with similar people, but the important connections will really be more complex and kind of like cut through. And in this process, what you're looking for are those implicit and hidden meanings that are only uncovered by relating kind of those discrete pieces of data to one another and positioning them near each other. Going to the next slide here. When we talk about what the output of affinity mapping is, the output of the map, the diagram isn't as, it's not as much about that kind of artifact as it is the conclusions of the data. So the process of affinity mapping and creating consensus and that like building that spatial understanding of the data itself is often way more valuable than the diagram itself. And those themes or the thematic takeaways of the patterns of data in those clusters, the prominence or their size of those clusters kind of starts to clue or kind of indicate what those emerging insights might be. Some tips for affinity mapping. So each note should include a single thought, a really short, discrete snippet of data, like an observation or a quote or very specific feedback. Something very important with affinity mapping is that you should let the notes inform the grouping rather than the other way around. So you're not going to want to create kind of containers and then cherry pick what fits into those. It's kind of, we use grounded theory to let the data kind of like bubble up the themes. And when you're naming those themes, it should be enough to sort of thematically understand the contents of the groups without having to go back and read each note.
Awesome. Thanks, Allison. So we're also going to be talking about tagging. And so to talk about tagging, tags can be used to code pieces of meaningful qualitative data. And hopefully that word code isn't intimidating for any of you here. In this context, it isn't coding as much as what we think about sort of engineers or developers coding software, as much as it is just about creating a system for assigning meaning that will help you organize your data to find connections later on. So you might code or tag data in order to trace back to the original source. For example, we always use tags for participants so that we know who said what when we're in our analysis phase. You might also use tags to assign meaning to data that can be analyzed across an entire data set. So for example, if you're working on within a larger research repository or a larger research project, you might have different tags that you need to use across those projects so that you can bubble up that data in meaningful ways later on. And to give some examples here, we put together these tags for you to use and bucketed them into 2 groups. So there's kind of these 2 ways of thinking about tags, macro and micro. On the macro side, these examples of tags are really good for zooming out. These are codes that are agnostic to the set of data that you're using within Framework. So that means that you might call on these tags to use for every single one of your research projects. And some of the examples there would be the participant tag or the data source. Sometimes the data source is really helpful because then it can help us understand, is this data coming from an interview or is it coming from a survey? Is this coming from inside of our organization or outside of our organization? Also mental models, which we'll take a deeper look at in the next slide. Personas, the phase in a customer journey. Sentiment is another one that you might call on to use across research projects. It can help you understand, especially in UX research, where negative sentiment might be identified in your data set so that you can easily, quickly kind of identify, looking at negative sentiment, where opportunities or room for improvement might be. And then on the micro side, these tags are really good for zooming in, and these codes are often specific to the set of data and the specific research goals that you have in front of you. So here you might use tags to represent a particular feature in your product if you're doing user research, or maybe the steps in a user flow or customer experience. Tools is another one that we see a lot when we're looking at kind of jobs to be done interviews and trying to understand, what tools are people hiring across a particular experience. Behaviors and topics are some other examples of micro tags that you might use. And then in this next one, so it's a little bit tricky to give some examples of micro tags because, we don't necessarily have kind of the data set that you all are working with in front of us, but we thought that we could break it down and give you all some good examples of macro tags that could help you get started. So when we think about mental model tags, this could represent different types of data labeling, such as needs or pain points, desires, fears, motivation, all different ways to help you kind of go to your data and ask questions, such as, what are the fears that particular people have about particular keywords or particular parts of these interviews. You might also segment or think about macro tags around these other frameworks. So this next one, journey, the 5 E's, being able to kind of classify and label data as someone is moving through an experience. So entice, enter, engage, extend. The next one, quote, observation, behavior. This is another way of organizing data to understand, what are people saying versus doing, for example. And then also what are the sort of observational parts of the data. So what are the things that we're actually saying or the notes that we're actually taking? So you can sort of segment and get different perspectives from your data that way as well. So now that we've talked about synthesis, we've looked at affinity mapping, we've also taken a look at tags. We're going to move over into Notably and look at how tags and affinity maps and themes can be used on real research data. So I'm going to pull that up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quickly. But while I do that, before we move forward, we wanted to stop and see if we have any questions or any feedback on any of the topics that we've covered so far. You can drop your questions into the chat and we'll just kind of pause here for a few minutes, making sure that we're getting those questions answered for the group. And while we're doing that, if you haven't already, you can take a minute to sign up for a free account over at notably.ai. That way you can follow along with this process using the same data set.
Yeah, the data set that we are going to show you today is with every new account. So it's a sample project that you can kind of dig in and look at all the data that we're going to be talking about today. I did drop into the chat if anyone has any questions, but I'm not seeing any coming through. So if we're good to move forward, I'll keep an eye on this chat message. Can we address feature prioritization? Not sure what that means. Maybe you can rephrase the question. For affinity maps, should we limit on how many themes we should have? I often find qualitative data very messy and some user feedback often falls within many themes. Yeah, that's a really good question. Sometimes, I mean, it obviously depends on the volume of how many participants were involved in your study, but we tend to see around like 8 themes kind of bubble up from maybe like that sweet spot of like 5 to 8 interview participants. I wouldn't be so worried about like creating too many themes. What you're looking for is sort of like the volume of data inside of those themes. So I would be concerned if there was like only a handful of notes in a bunch of different themes. That might mean that you need to do another pass at sort of combining themes together. But I try not to be too like reserved with how I'm grouping things or overthink it. Like you kind of just have to keep doing a pass at it and combining it until you have some really strong thematic takeaways. So like maybe 5 to 8 or so. And then those end up translating into your insight statements, which again, you kind of want to have like 5 to 8 really strong insight statements that are kind of crossing over those different thematic areas. Let me see if I answered those. Some user feedback often falls within many themes. And I think that's fine too. Like some snippets of data can certainly substantiate or be evidence for multiple themes. But again, you want to make sure that you're not like, I guess, having duplicate themes and that it shouldn't actually be one theme together. Are there any other questions? All right. I'll keep an eye on this chat and kind of continue to look for questions here, but I want to give a little bit of a high level overview of this project. So this was actually a real research project that I did back in 2020. So as people do when they get bored during quarantine, they do research, I guess. I was 8 months pregnant with my third child, and my oldest child was in remote learning from Seattle. So it was a mess. It was a mess for everyone. And I think my way of like creating control around the situation was to control a research study. So I went out and interviewed a bunch of teachers and a bunch of parents to understand sort of their pain points and their perspectives of remote learning, and reveal potential opportunities for solving those pain points with design and technology. So I thought that I might actually follow on with some sort of educational technology tool or something like that. But this was a generative research study. So I think there was about 6 parents involved and then 6 teachers involved. And Brittany, do you want to give an overview of sort of how projects are laid out and notably?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the context, Allison, and excited to have this real example and data set that we can share today with you all. So to kind of orient you to what we're looking at in this project, we'll kind of move our way through some of the different layers here of the project, getting to notes where we'll spend the most time here doing some actual synthesis together. So to start here in this info page, what we're looking at is the info page is just a simple place for you to create some research documentation. So here you can see this is the plan, the research plan that Allison put together, kind of outlining the background of the project, defining the research goals, a little bit of information about the target audience. This is a way, especially if you're doing research inside of an organization, this is a best practice kind of baked in so that people who might be, searching your research repository later on can kind of find the context, right? Why was this research being done instead of others? So this is sort of a best practice kind of baked in for, especially if you're working on research projects with teams. And the next part here is data. So notably, this is where all of your raw research data lives and where you add it. So things like recordings, transcript files. Here you can see we have one recording already added into this example project. You see Allison's familiar face here. You can see the recording, this metadata that was associated with the recording, and then the transcript below. So if you have a recording, you can import it to Notably. We'll create a transcript for you. And from here, you have the option to kind of go through and find the important parts of this conversation. So for example, if I wanted to say, hey, this seems important, let's create this as a highlight. Then from here, I click add highlights as notes. And then that is automatically going to add that sort of snippet of qualitative data to our board. So when we get into notes, those notes are created in 2 kind of separate split screen workspaces, both on the canvas and also on the table. Like to say if you're kind of left-brained or right-brained, you have the opportunity to work with data in sort of the environment that feels most familiar or comfortable to you. So whatever you do in one side is automatically copied over. So you can see these notes were added here. I'm gonna just kind of get rid of them for now, but yeah, so to kind of orient you to what we're looking at here, some of this data has already been So it's been tagged in advance, and it has also been partially themed in advance. So what that means is we will be kind of taking a look at creating some themes and also looking at how we're using tags. And then we'll wrap up by kind of seeing, seeing the reward of those efforts. So by tagging data, by theming data, we'll take a look at how you can ask very powerful questions that will help you to inspire the next phase, which is writing insights. And we'll get into that in the last sort of part of this workshop. So yeah, one thing that I think can be helpful to start with to give context to how this data is set up is looking at the tags that we've used. So here you can see that we've followed sort of some of those best practices that Allison mentioned in talking about affinity maps. So each of these notes here represents sort of one complete thought or one sort of complete idea or snippet. And then this data has been tagged in advance a couple of different ways. So clicking in here, we can kind of see the list of tags that we used. So this T6, Allison, this represents the code for teachers. So you can see we have teacher here, but we also have T6, T2, T3. This means a tag for all of the data that came from the interviews with teachers, as well as a very specific participant tag. So we know in sort of a depersonalized or anonymous way who said what. Sometimes you might pull in specific data, so you might actually use their name as a tag, or even their first name or their last name, or maybe their email. Sometimes you might want to go for this more sort of obfuscated route for tracking participants at this stage. Really just depends. Maybe it depends on the data policies inside your organization, or maybe it depends on how important it is for you to put kind of a name to this data. Some of the other examples that we have here are calling on those mental models that we talked about before. So you can see here, we have this very specific or micro example of a tag between teacher and parent specific to this data in front of us. But we also have some of the more agnostic or mental model tags, such as tools or quote or needs, feelings. So all of this data has been tagged in advance to save us time, but this is where this is where you, will spend some time up front getting all of this data kind of labeled and organized. We do help you. So like Allison mentioned, we do help to do some tagging automation. We're always looking for new ways to do more of that to help you kind of breeze past the tedious or monotonous parts of getting ready for synthesis. And one of the ways that we do that is with sentiment analysis. So here, all of this has actually been tagged automatically by AI. So this is giving us sort of a quantitative, very fast way of understanding what is the sentiment across this data, both from a positive, negative, or neutral perspective. So yeah, now that we have taken a look at kind of how this data has been set up with tags and the type of data that's here, we can jump back into the canvas and take a look at some of the themes that are already here. And then we'll create two themes together. So zooming in here, you can see that this data kind of represents, within these themes here, it represents data that's been tagged kind of from across this data set. So you can see here this theme of desire for more involvement. It has teacher quotes, it has parent quotes. Also here, you can see some of the other kind of larger themes, such as, see some examples, balancing work from home and learning. You can see kind of heavily parent topic here, but some teachers chiming in as well. So really those tags, they're sort of represented across themes. And then we have de-themed or unthemed for the purpose of today, some of the themes that we've already recognized. So zooming in here, you can kind of see this example of some tags that used to be a theme, or some notes that used to be in a theme, but we've removed it. And we thought it could be helpful or fun to kind of go through this process as if as if we didn't know that this was already a theme, or as if we were looking at this data for the first time together. And like Allison said, with this particular type of methodology for a synthesis, the affinity map, it creates a really good opportunity for what is called collaborative learning. So it's this concept which is often talked about in classroom education, but also, overall it's sort of the study around how humans learn most effectively. And it looks at all different types of things, such as the quickness to clarity, also the sort of momentum and energy that's created. So this theory says that when one or more people discover something new, create knowledge together, discover it together, that it not only do you remember it more, but you often have more sort of enthusiasm, more trust around the concepts, and you also have more sort of energy around applying that new knowledge in the field. So this is why it can be really helpful to invite someone into that process with you, because then it amplifies the learning opportunity that you have. So oftentimes when we are doing a collaborative synthesis using an affinity map, one person is driving and we're literally going one by one, reading them out loud. Mm-hmm. So Allison, do you want to kind of take over and?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you can cluster them. I'm not in the right now, but I can speak to sort of like what I was hearing and why these were a theme. So this was kind of mostly from the parents. There was a little bit of the same thing that I was hearing from teachers as well, but there was this concept around like parents. It's not like there was not a willingness or desire to help their children with their remote learning, but there was this like sort of lack of understanding of the methods and approach for teaching concepts that parents were fearful of. So they feel like they were teaching them the wrong way, or they weren't able to have that kind of that continuity from like how the teacher was teaching certain concepts at home. I can give like kind of an example. My son is he's 7 years old and he's in second grade now, but he comes home and he's like talking about regrouping, like for math and like adding together like 3-digit numbers and stuff, and telling me like I was regrouping the wrong way. I was teaching him to do addition and subtraction the wrong way. I guess there's a wrong way to do this. And so that kind of concept of creating confusion or fear of like putting them on the wrong track and teaching them the wrong ways was something that I continued to hear. So this was something that ultimately became a greater theme throughout all the conversations here. It's like, how do we, and then so we clustered these together. So Brittany, if you want to go ahead and cluster them. And then like we can look at this theme and be like, how might we better equip parents with the methods and the confidence of teaching concepts at home. So like it's not just about giving parents like, okay, these are the worksheets they need to complete. It's how do we teach them how to teach. So that was a really important takeaway.
Awesome. One thing to know about, if we were doing this from scratch, if we didn't already have, for the sake of time, some of these notes clustered together, one of the things that we will often do is not worry so much about labeling the theme in the moment. So, you can just use your logic or intuition to say, hey, this sounds similar, this feels related, let's go ahead and just group these together, even if we don't know why or what to call it. So you can see here, you have the option to kind of create this group, but you don't necessarily have to give it a name until you're ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that this process too, it's a matter of ungrouping and regrouping. Like you may take some of these out. Not every card needs to be in a group either. I think that's also like, you don't need to force a theme. There are outliers. There are people who are going to be just saying one-off things, and that's okay. And that's going to happen. So there will be kind of, I like to call it like a parking lot, or just like this other area of just kind of anecdotal things that you heard. And that doesn't mean they're not important. It just means it's not a thematic takeaway. That's okay.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So then here we have a slightly kind of bigger theme that we unthemed for this conversation. So Allison, do you want to talk about kind of why the data here became a pattern?
Sure. So I focused my conversations on teachers and parents for elementary school children. And, there were a couple of those parents who had older children who were kind of suggesting that they were actually doing fine with the remote learning, that they had a little bit more autonomy and they were taking more ownership over their work. But there was this theme around, these younger kids, they need that human face-to-face connection, and they were really struggling without being able to see their peers and see their teachers. And I don't know if there are some parents here, but like I remember sort of seeing my own sons like light up whenever he got to see his friends on Zoom and see his teacher, but it was very difficult to sort of have effective conversations to establish sort of that human connection through Zoom. And kids are already during that time, like, increased screen time and increased Zoom conversations with family and friends. It was just really hard for them not to be physically in front of each other. And that was hard to ignore as a theme coming up over and over and over again. For the most part, people spoke about Zoom as being really the only positive experience of the entire remote learning period of their life. So yeah, this was a big one. Maybe we can see Brittany, because I think what's really cool, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, but it's really cool to like kind of look at these clusters and not just see the color by the theme, but like what are some different ways that we can pull apart this data and start to see almost like themes inside the themes, or how data sort of like sentiment is kind of popping up inside of these themes.
Yeah, definitely. So here, this is where all of your hard work really pays off when it comes to the time that you spent to kind of methodically tag your data and go through and diligently look for themes. Because now, not only do you have sort of these nice clusters that you can go and say, hey, these are important by the size of them, by the sort of scope of them or the diversity of them, but you can also kind of segment this data in unique ways to both maybe inspire additional insights or to even poke or prod at maybe this isn't it, or maybe this isn't quite right. So for example, one of the things that we often like to do is, now that we understand the theme, what does the sentiment look like in those themes? So where are the themes that are quite problematic for the people that we're talking to in terms of sentiment, or where are some of the themes where we do find some positive sentiment or some at least enjoyable sounding experiences. So you can recolor to kind of look for sentiment now within those themes and zoom in and try to understand, okay, well, of some of these, what were some of the positive things that people were saying? And I think Allison just mentioned this, that Zoom seemed to be one of the sort of reliable, enjoyable, positive things that parents and teachers had to share around remote learning.
Yeah.
Whereas some of the other ones here seem to skew more to the negative side.
Yeah, this was kind of a dark time, for a lot of people, and just in general, this is a pretty tough subject, as you can see. So there's a lot of negative sentiment going on, but it is really interesting to kind of see where those clusters of positive sentiment are happening and how do we create more of those moments, right? Like, because pain points, they are where the opportunity is, right? So how do we look at some of these themes and see how they could be improved with design, with technology, with how can we bring more positive moments into these people's lives?
Mm-hmm. And because we've organized our data in these kind of intentional ways using tags up front, now that we have our themes, we can also say, well, what are our teachers saying across these themes, and use color as sort of a visual cue to understand, okay, wow, here is a theme that only teachers seem to be caring about. Or, here's maybe themes where there's a lot of sort of like equal distribution across parents and teachers. And this is, this is another helpful way of understanding, not just your theme, but how does your theme interact with other types of labels or categories that you sort of identified as meaningful through your tag selections. One of the things that you can also do, so since we use this idea of a quote, so this means that, so we've kind of use this tag to identify powerful parts of these interviews to say, whether this is a part of a theme or whether a teacher said this or whether a parent said this, that this is important. And so now you could filter down to see, okay, well, of our themes, what are our most important things that people have said? You can also kind of drill down even further if you wanted to quickly kind of identify what is it, what
Right.
some of our kind of what are some of the quotes for teachers, or what are some of the quotes for parents specifically? So for example, maybe if we wanted to look for,
You're under free coloring. So if you go to filter.
yeah, I was like, why is that not working? So for example, if we wanted to look for the teacher tags, then maybe we could recolor them by sentiment. So here's all of the things that teachers are saying. We could even drill down even further to say, well, what were the most important things that teachers were saying by sentiment, and kind of zoom in and understand, the important parts coded by sentiment across themes. So you can see here, by kind of taking the time to properly kind of code your data and maybe hiring a little bit of technology to help out with the sentiment analysis, you have the option to ask these very kind of powerful questions across your data set and use those answers to inspire deeper perspectives and really push your insights further. So yeah, now that we've kind of taken a look at some of the examples of tagging, how to create affinities, how to call on those tags and call on those themes afterwards to ask questions. The next step here is, what does it all mean? Why does it matter? What can we do about some of these things that we've learned? And so we're going to be spending the last few minutes today kind of handing things back over to Allison and talking about how to use this data to tell those stories through insights. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back into our deck where we'll talk about insights. Allison, I think we might have had some questions popping up in the channel.
Yeah, I've been trying to multitask, answering them as I go. But let me know if I missed anything here.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, so writing insights, that's always the part that I don't dread it. I do think it's the nice like buttoning up of all of your research effort, but it's hard. It's hard to write impactful insight statements that really move everyone from a product team to the CEO. Like, this becomes the future. What are we going to work on? What are we going to build? How are we going to solve for these things? Like, how do we translate hours of conversation and calls into something actionable and inspiring? The thing is, so like writing insights is both scientific. Brittany, if you want to go to the next page, writing insights is both scientific and creative. I feel like, for the majority of research the majority of the research project, you spend your time kind of being extremely objective, very methodical, very unbiased. And then like at a certain inflection point, you kind of have to switch that off a little bit and bring yourself to the table. Of course, someone's starting to mow their lawn right now. So this part becomes very subjective and creative and intuitive and storytelling. And that's where you have to bring yourself to it. Writing insights requires this confidence, sort of in acting on an informed hunch. So use that partial information to inject your opinion and create a complete view, or what I like to call kind of like the truths of the world through the lens of your research participants. and you have to use that partial information, act on your hunch, make a judgment call, and start to really break the rules to tell an inspiring story that inspires action. And insights should present an opportunity or potential for the future, but not necessarily the solution itself. So you really want to detach your insight statements from, starting to poke and prod at solutions. And this is especially hard if you're a designer. Like, I feel like researchers are a lot better at kind of reserving themselves from thinking too much about solutions. So as a designer, you have to really make sure you leave ideation open for solutions. Don't try to, solution too soon. Okay. So an insight statement, one of our researchers we interviewed shared with us this term of like an ODA observation statement. And I thought it was really catchy, so I'm borrowing it from her. She shared it as this sort of like big fear, right, of like coming back with hours of research that is either obvious or that stakeholders already know to be true. So it's important to not confuse an observational statement with an insight statement. If we try to stay too objective with an insight statement, and when we don't really dig those layers deep and asking why and prod and probe and peel away at the data, we will only get surface level insights, and that's not very inspiring. So here's just like a template that you can use and change and do whatever you want with, but I like to kind of combine how people think and feel and what people do, so their state of mind, their behavior, with why do I think that they feel this way? Why are they doing this? What is my what do I think that they're not saying, or what I'm not observing? So that becomes your because or your motivation. And then add in like, what is the sorry, can you go back? What is the actionable desired outcome? So what do we need to do about it? Because just saying an observation and why you think they do something is, you need to like add in an action. So this next slide will give you a specific example. I like to use kind of like a quadrant sometimes, kind of as an exercise to get me going with, thinking. So what did we see? Maybe I'm doing some research around an autonomous car technology or something. What we saw, the driver turned off lane departure assistant in her car. Okay, but what did we hear? She said, I feel safe as driving in a new car with the latest technology and safety features. So there's that interesting delta, that like tension that is inspiring and interesting. So what does that mean? It means that drivers want vehicles equipped with autonomous technology, but they don't trust it fully. Okay, that's interesting. Like, why do they want it if they're not going to use it? So maybe a theory or an idea or a hypothesis that drivers need to trust how autonomous features are going to respond in life-threatening scenarios on the road. So that's the implication. And then, together those two things will become your insight statement, and you can start ideating around these things. Like, how do we create more trust around autonomous technology in the road? So if we go back to, notably, we can look at how you document insights in a project. So in the past, I've kind of always had just a split screen of like, okay, here's my canvas, and then I'm just going to open up a blank document and start drafting up my insights. And notably, they're kind of married together. So you can be looking at your data, doing your clustering, seeing these themes, and quickly draft in the side panel here your insights. And it's just a simple document for now. We're actually releasing something really exciting where each insight will be its own object here, so that you can kind of individually reference each insight. But you start to build up your storytelling, your narrative around the things that you're now seeing on your board. So why does it matter? What are we going to do about it? So you can take a look. Feel free to read these if you want. They're kind of long, but yeah, in here are all the nuggets and inspirational stuff that then the design team is going to go off and ideate around to solve for. So I think that's it. We have some time here, 7 minutes to be precise, to answer any additional questions. I know we were saying kind of like just put them in the chat, but also feel free to unmute yourself if you want and ask us a question. We're here till 1 to answer any questions. We can talk about any of the topics that we've discussed so far, or hop into notably, really however we want to use this time. We do have some probes here, as any researcher would, to kind of have some questions prepared in case no one had any additional questions. But yeah, I'll leave it open to you all first before I get jump to this. We have a question here. I saw, and notably, that there is a way to import transcriptions from Otter, but now I can't figure out how to do it. Did I imagine that? So we do allow, Otter exports a format called the SRT file. And so you can import an SRT file into Notably, and it should work fine there. So I don't know if you're catching a bug here, or maybe it's not an SRT file. I don't know. I don't think they allow any other export types. Do you know, Brittany? Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm pretty sure that Otter's transcript export does have an SRT file, so it should be working. But yeah, this, maybe if you're in there, you see we have a banner saying that we're in beta, that the feature is relatively new. So it's possible it might be something on our end, a browser issue. We can definitely follow up with you after the call, because theoretically it should be working.
All right, we have, sorry. We have one other question here. What integrations do you have? So we are working on a Zoom integration right now, actually on a Zoom app and an integration. And the Zoom integration is going to be awesome because you can just connect your Zoom account and it'll automatically pull back the videos that you want into your project so that you don't have to wait for it to upload. Because as you know, with a lot of these conversations being 1 hour long, sometimes they can take a little bit of time to upload and transcribe. So a Zoom integration will speed that up so that you don't have to wait when it's time to do all of your analysis, which is great. And then our Zoom app, I'm going to let Brittany talk about the Zoom app. She's really excited about the Zoom app.
Yeah, so the Zoom app is going to be kind of another layer to the Zoom integration. You know, we spent a lot of time talking with researchers over the past year, especially around kind of how their process has changed since, you know, the pandemic and all of this remote research happening. And time again, you know, people were saying really positive things about Zoom, as we also saw in the parent teacher kind of conversations. And it kind of comes down to, we think researchers are, what we're hearing from researchers is that they're using Zoom because it's both reliable and familiar for their participants, you know, especially if you're doing user testing, Zoom being kind of the household name that it is after this past year. You know, it's one less thing that their participant might have to kind of fumble with. You definitely don't want to have to worry about kind of quality issues. So we know that researchers are using Zoom, and we're really excited about the Zoom app, because the Zoom app will help you to not only, you know, capture parts of the kind of transcript in real time. So you'll be able to use your mouse or your keyboard to kind of highlight parts of the transcript in advance during the call. And you'll also be able to use the Zoom app to take notes. So we know that even if you are using a transcript, a lot of researchers are still relying on their notes. Sometimes, you know, they're taking notes around things that aren't going to show up in the transcript, like, you know, something that the user might be doing in a usability session, or maybe just an observation or an inference that you're having during the conversation that you want to capture. And so with the Zoom app, we'll be able to marry that data together in a really nice format for you within the data file, so that all of your notes and the highlights that you've created during the call will all be in one place. So yeah, we're really excited about that. I mean, being able to take notes in Zoom, we also think, you know, as researchers who kind of are taking notes and doing a lot of interviews ourselves, when you're taking notes somewhere else, you're usually not looking kind of directly into the camera or into Zoom, or sort of like making eye contact with the participant that you're interviewing. And so we hope by bringing that kind of note-taking experience into Zoom, we'll be able to just create a little bit more of a focused note-taking experience.
A follow-up to our response. Besides Zoom, is there another integration? And I'm going to turn that back on you and ask what other integration you might be interested in using that we haven't talked about today. We are definitely, we're focusing right now, kind of just to be honest with you and transparent, with getting data into Notably and that native Notably experience, but are of course interested in integrating, playing nicely with other tools that are in the researchers tool stack as well. And that kind of goes along with sort of exporting. Someone asked, does Notably export to other formats? Can it export to a CSV or Excel file? And we don't have export right now, but of course, we believe that your data is your data and would absolutely export it. And we'll have that feature.
Yeah, I would say if you want to be able to export the data, go onto the app. There's a little question mark in the bottom right-hand corner. Shoot us a note and let us know that you want it. And yeah, from our end, it's not too far away from being possible, but that extra kind of request from you all, being able to share that with our team will go a long way for making that happen.
Yeah. And the last one here, I'd be interested in output to slides, which is really interesting that you kind of tuned in on that, because that is kind of where we see Notably going as well. We want to be able to ultimately present these insights out, right? Because we know that a lot of researchers end up in that sort of, okay, time to put together a deck or time to put together a PowerPoint. And those things are often sort of severed from the data itself, or, you know, it's not a living, breathing thing. So we are working towards a vision for Notably where you can like present this out to your team and then have evidence to support it, and kind of like a nice video clip in a very presentable way, because we know that's important, right? Like how your research ultimately looks to the people, your stakeholders, is important. And we want to give kind of researchers the tools to present their research in the best possible way. So yeah, slides, kind of presentation, that's definitely where we're going. And how do you share this across teams? So there's a different, we have viewers and then we have contributors. So people who are actively contributing to research projects can get into Notably and have that kind of full experience. And then we will have a view only account as well, where people who are just ingesting the research information. So there will be soon a share button inside of your insights area where you can share out insights publicly to anyone inside of your organization. And they can see sort of these snippets or pieces of evidence that you've chosen to support those insights in a really nice way. And yeah, Rhonda says, take my money. Happily, will do. No, but thank you guys so much. We're at time now. We hope this was really informative. We would love to continue doing these if there's interest and kind of like open to different topics. Let us know how you think this went and what we could do better, what we could emphasize more on, what we could emphasize less on. Yeah, we really enjoyed doing this. We love talking to researchers and people who get kind of like this space. And yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to add, if you enjoyed this session, if you came from the User Research Collective, please leave a comment, let the rest of the community know that this was helpful. We really appreciate if you like Notably, if you like these workshops, sharing them out with your colleagues or friends. We're just getting started and we really appreciate your support and your time today. So with that, we will wrap things up. Thank you so much for coming. We hope you all have a good weekend and look forward to connecting with more of you in the future. Bye.
Bye, everyone.